Happy Hanukkah, everyone. Afreilach Hanukkah, Hanukkah Sameach. I'm so happy to be here again with you today. A very special evening on the first night of Hanukkah. And I wanted to welcome all of you to another lecture by the renowned Dr. David B Levy, who is going to talk to us tonight about the spiritual, halachic, and historical aspects of Hanukkah and the Menorah.
Thank you so much, Alita Portnoy, for that wonderful introduction. The festival of the 8 days of Hanukkah. And on Hanukkah this year, which starts the 10th of December through the 18th, Jews will celebrate the miraculous victory of the Maccabees over the Hellenized Syrians, whereby in the rededication of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the miracle of the oil lasted a full 8 days rather than the expected 1 day. To continue our lecture series from the theme of censorship, we should note that the Sefria Maccabean, which we have in Hebrew here, notes that Sifrei Torah were burned by Antiochus IV. Uvachamisha asar yom bekislev bechamesh arba'im ume'a shana Banu shikutz mishomeim al hamizbeach, uva'arei Yehuda misaviv banu bamot, uvefitchei habatim, uverchovot zivachu, vesifrei haTorah asher matza'u sarafu ba'esh, v'kol asher yimtzei biyadav sefer brit, V'kol asher yichapotz b'Torah tzivah hamelech lacham mito. So the persecutions of the Jews under the Syrian Greeks around the 15th day of Kislev in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of the burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Yehuda and burned incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. And the books of the law, which they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or if anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. Jews were forbidden to teach Torah, to practice kashrut, brit milah, and basic fundamentals of Jewish life like family purity. So we have to ask the question, not going to a Sefer HaChitzonim, but where in the Talmud is the reason for Hanukkah? We find a discussion of Hanukkah in Masechet Shabbat around 21 Amud Bet, and we ask, Ma'i Chanukah, what is the reason for Hanukkah? Ditanu Rabbanan, B'chof Hei B'Kislev, Yomei de Chanukah Timniya Inun, Dala Lemispad Bachon, V'dala Lehit Agot Bachon, V'shekeg Nesu Yevanim lehechal tim'u kol hashmanim shebehechal v'keshevera malchut beit hashamonai v'nitzachum badeku v'lo metzu ela pach echad shel shemen shehaya muna Chotamo shel Kohen Gadol, v'lo haya bo ela lahadlik yom echad, na'asa bo nes v'hadliku mimenu shemona yamim, l'shega acheret kiva'um v'asi'um yamim tovim behalel v'hoda'ah. So the reason for Hanukkah, our rabbis taught, on the 25th of Kislev began the 8 days of Hanukkah, during which eulogies and fasting were not permitted. But when the Syrian Greeks entered the Beit HaMikdash, they defiled all the oils that were in the temple. When the Hasmoneans prevailed and defeated them, they sought but found only one container of oil with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, containing only enough light for one day. But a miracle occurred in which they lit the lamp from its oil for 8 days. The following year they established those days as a festival with songs and praise and thanksgiving. Although there is a phenomena of a military rabbi known in German as Kaplan, or recently the great Rav Goren in Israel would go into battle to retrieve body parts, the rabbis in general, Chutz La'aretz, regarded Hanukkah not to focus on the military might of the Maccabees, but rather the Kedusha that they restored in rededicating the Beit HaMikdash. Ironically, the descendants of the Maccabees, known as the Hasmoneans, invited the Romans in to rule ancient Palestine, and it was the Roman government that rather later served as the vehicle of destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. Around 70 C, many Jews remain in Galut since 70 C because the Roman Churban. During the diaspora, rabbis classified the categories of different types of war that are mentioned in biblical history, including those of the Maccabees. The Maccabee battles against the Seleucids was classified as Milchemet Mitzvah, commanded war, versus the other two types of war known as Milchemet Reshut, discretionary war, and Milchemet Hovah, justified obligatory war. There's a PowerPoint that Alita Portnoy will link on the different types of war in rabbinic halacha. The rabbis, however, downplayed the military aspect of the Maccabees, and in their construction of the prayer known as Al Hanisim, emphasized the foremost importance of the supernal intellectual Torah and Kedusha over military might. So the Al Hanisim prayer, which we sing on Hanukkah, sounds a little bit like this. Ve'al Hanisim, ve'al Forkan, ve'al Givurot, ve'al Teshuot, ve'al Niflot, she'asita lavotenu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. So we thank Hashem for the miracles, for redemption, for the mighty deeds, the saving acts, and for the wonders which Hashem wrought for our ancestors in those days. So there is acknowledgement of the military victory. But embedded within the prayer, we read, Masarta Giborim Biyad Chalashim. They gave over the mighty into the hands of the more weak. The Rabim Biyad Ma'atim, and the many into the hands of the few. The Time'im Biyad Tehorim, and the impure into the hands of the pure. The Risha'im Biyad Tzadikim, and the wicked into the hands of the righteous. The Hazedim Biyad Oske Toratecha, and those who are devoid of Torah into those who busy themselves and learn Torah. So this Al Hanisim prayer is emphasizing that it's not by might, but by, as I will hope to show, the voice of Yaakov that rings in this yeshivot of Shem ve'Aver, Torah study. That is the real victory of Hanukkah. The rabbinic emphasis is on devotion to Torah and not necessarily solely military prowess. As Rabbi David Soloveitchik notes, the learning of Torah in Israel protects the state of Israel as much as the IDF. This emphasis is found in the difference between Esav and Yaakov. In the Torah portion Toldot, Isaac declares, Vayigash Yaakov el Yitzhak Aviv, Vayimushehu Vayomer Hakol Kol Yaakov V'Hayadayim Yedei Esav. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esav. According to rabbinic interpretation, the voice of Yaakov is the voice of Torah study in the yeshivot of Shem ve'Aver, identified with intellectual and spiritual virtue. It connotes Torah study and tefillot. The Midrash explains the voice of Yaakov is the voice coming from the academies of learning and the synagogues. The hands of Esau, who was a hunter and sportsman, refer to the bloodshed of military prowess. The Midrash comments, no war is successful unless the seed of Esau has a share in it. The rabbis chose the prophetic reading for the Shabbos of Hanukkah from Zechariah, who in chapter 4, verse 6 states, Vaya'an vayomer Elai lemor, Zed devar Hashem el Zerubbabel lemor, Lo b'chayil velo b'koach, Ki im beruchi, Amar Hashem Zevaot. Then he answered and spoke unto me, saying, this is the word of the Lord of Zerubbabel, saying, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Before the Navi Zechariah, the prophet Yeremahu in chapter 9, who lived just before the destruction of the first temple, says similarly, Im bezot yithalalel, ha-mithalalel, ha-skel v'yodea oti ki ani Hashem, osei chesed mishpat utzedakah ba'aretz, ki be'ele chafatzti ne'um Hashem. Thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let him glory in this. And what I read was that he understandeth and knoweth me, that I am the Lord who exercises mercy, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, saith the Lord. The prophet Micha in chapter 6 echoes these ideas in answering Moshe's question, what does God require? Declaring, Higid lecha Adam, ma tov, u'ma Hashem doresh mi mecha. Ki im asot mishpat ve'ahavat chesed ve'hatznea lechet im elokecha. He has shown you, a man, what is good and what does the Eternal require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your Creator. So here we see Yeremahu, Zechariah, and Micha are giving voice to the voice of Yaakov. The rabbis in the diaspora generally warned in rabbinic texts against engaging in rebellion, war, and military resistance against host powers, Dine de Malchuta Dina, attempting to bring the Mashiach by human means, according to most rabbis in the diaspora, through war or revolution, rather than waiting for Hashem to bring the Mashiach, constitutes forcing Hashem's hand, dochin et haketz, and could prove disastrous. If the Jews were to ascend to Israel in a wall, bechoma. The verse from the Song of Songs, Cherishing, O daughters of Jerusalem, do not wake or arouse love before it is wished, appears in three pasukim really. In 2:7, Hishbati etchem banot Yerushalayim b'tzivaot, O ba'alot hasadeh, im ta'iru v'im te'oraru et ha'ava ad shetechapatz. So I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and by the hinds of the fields, that ye awaken not nor stir up love until it please. That's repeated in 3:5, and then a little variation in 8:4. Hishbati etchem banot Yerushalayim ma ta'iru u'ma te'oraru et ha'ava ad shetechapatz. So these three vows were seen as warnings that Israel not ascend to Eretz Israel in mass, nor rebel against their inferior position under the host Gentiles. In response to Hashem will not allow the Gentiles to persecute the Jews overly much. Yoter midai. Radical Zionism's call to negate the diaspora, shalalala galut, preceded the decades prior to the formation of the new state in 1948 after the Shoah. With the re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 as a political entity, Jewish sovereignty was restored to the Jewish people, and Rav Zevin went on the Har Bayit and blew the shofar and davened. The Jewish people found that to protect the state from surrounding threats, The maintenance of the IDF was again necessary for self-preservation, raising the question of the rabbinic understandings of war, military engagement, as this relates to religious life, especially as the Middle East conflict is increasingly being polarized into a war of religions, as during the medieval Crusades. A uniqueness of the Maccabees was that they were characterized by their military success and waged war against their foes as an act of restoring control of Israel against invading, assimilating forces. Before the Maccabees, Jewish leaders such as Moshe, Yeshua, Gideon, Shaul, David all led the Israelites in military battles. It says, Shaul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Amalekites, Shemak Shemo, the Philistines, were just the name of 4 peoples with whom the Israelite leaders engaged in war. However, the rabbis, in interpreting the reception history of these mighty battles, often de-emphasized the military side in favor of rabbinic virtues, like learning. Thus, Yehudah Maccabee's refusal to sacrifice an unkosher animal on the altar at Moda'in emphasized the laws of kashrut and purity, rather than Yehudah's action of using the slaughtering knife to stab the Roman official with his own knife, demanding that an unkosher animal be sacrificed, just as the rabbis emphasized that in addition to using only the pure oil of the high priest in the Beit HaMikdash during the temple dedication, the Maccabees purified the temple from the statues of Roman gods and immersed the menorah and other vessels in a mikveh as part of a rededication, Hanukkah Habayit. So we see from the rabbinic reception history an emphasis on the Hanukkah story, not focus on military victory and military battle per se, but rather emphasis on reinstatement of Kedusha, God's presence, the wonder of miracles, thanksgiving to God, and as the Al Nisim prayer states, devotion and emunah to Hashem, the triumph of the righteous, the overthrow of the arrogant, by downplaying the military conquest of the rabbis, exalted rabbinic virtues of humility, purity, compassion, and mercy, and thereby echoed the voice of Yaakov in the clarion call of the Nevi'im, Yerimahu, Zechariah, and Micha. So, in that sense, the Al Nisim prayer is a prayer of the spiritual aspects of Hanukkah. It is true, the Maccabees waged battles, but the prayer emphasizes Masarta Giborim biyad Chalashim V'Rabim biyad Me'atim U'Mita'im biyad Taharim V'Rashim biyad Tzadikim V'Zaidim biyad Oskei Toratecha. So the question of what is Yaakov learning in the tense of Shem Be'aver is not just spirituality of davening, but also halachot. So we're going to look at some of the halachic debates and issues relating to the lighting of the menorah on Hanukkah. The mitzvah of advertising the miracle or broadcasting the miracle applies to the lighting of the Hanukkah menorah. Chanting the Megillah in public on Purim, the Arba Kosot on Pesach. Beit Hillel holds that we light one candle with the shamash on the first night of Hanukkah and add an extra candle each night for 8 days of Hanukkah, which is the opposite opinion of Beit Shammai. Now, why 8 days of Hanukkah? The oil did last 8 days. That's a miracle, yes. And 8 is Mumala Lateva. But if we look back to Shlomo HaMelech and the building of the Beit HaMikdash, the Bayit Rishon, there were 8 days of commemoration as well. So the Maccabees are trying to echo that Kedusha of the Bayit Rishon. The question of where to light the menorah. In addition to, besides the window or doorway of a private home, which appears in Sefer Shibbolei Halakhic by Rabbi Zedekiah ben Rabbi Avraham Harofe in 1210 to 1275 of the Anavim of Rome, Inyan Hanukkah Siman 185. the rabbi-physician notes the customs and collected Halakhic rulings of French and German Torah scholars. This work is arranged topically and includes Halachic decisions, comments on the prayers, and explanation of customs. This rabbi, the physician, argues the menorah on Hanukkah should be lit in a synagogue because at that time in the Middle Ages, wayfarers and traveling poor Talmud scholars slept on the benches and the back of the shul, and must also be yotzei the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah menorah. Although Sefer HaManhig by Hilchot Hanukkah, page 531, by Rabbi Avraham ben Rabbi Nathan, born in Lunel, Provence, ended up in Toledo, Spain, gives a different reason for why the menorah on Hanukkah should be lit in the synagogue. Rav Avram ben Natan cites the common practice that the rabbi or the shamash often lives in the attic of the synagogue or in the adjacent attached house. If this is the case, then the menorah on Hanukkah should be lit in the synagogue, which serves as a Beit HaMikdash Ma'at. Rav Avram ben Rabbi Natan also points out that the mezuzah is required to be on the house of a private dwelling on the right side of the door. While it may be attached in a synagogue, there is no halachic requirement to do so. During Rav Avram ben Natan's wanderings, he noted the difference in customs between various communities and later composed Manhig B'nai HaOlam, also known as HaManhig. His work based on the writings of Hazal, the Halachic decisions of the Gaonim, and works of Spanish, French, and Provençal scholars. In it, he details various customs and their sources and sets down his own Halachic decision. The work also contains a number of responsa. HaManhig serves as a source for many of the Halachic decisions of the rabbis who followed him, particularly the earlier code of the Torah and the later code of Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Beit Yosef. The responsa of the Rivash, Simon 111, by Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet Perefet, born in Barcelona and ended up in Algiers, gives a different reason regarding the question of lighting the menorah on Hanukkah in the synagogue. The Rivash studied under Rabbi Nisim ben Ruvain Ran in Barcelona and later served as a rabbi in Jewish communities in Spain. In 1391, in the wake of severe anti-Jewish riots in Spain, the Rivash fled to Algiers, where he became Ab Bet Din. The Rivash weighs in on this halachic question by noting, for example, that on Pesach, Kiddush is not said in the shul, because the congregants are going to go home and recite Kiddush at the Seder. However, Hallel on the first night of Pesach is often said in the synagogue, in Hasidic custom. Thus, since the bracha is said for Hallel, then we say the bracha for lighting the menorah on Hanukkah. The Rivash also gives the reason to increase for some Hanes, the menorah on Hanukkah is lit in the synagogue. The Rivash refers to the special case also if the synagogue faces out on a courtyard where there are two dwelling entrance openings onto the courtyard. The question of where to place the menorah concerns the Trumas Hadeshin in Simon 104 by Rabbi Yisrael ben Petachia Isserlein, born in Regensburg, Germany, and ended up in Vienna Neustadt. All decisors agree that the menorah should cause pirsa nisa, but if there is danger of attack from outside antagonists, pekuach nefesh may in some cases permit lighting just for the family. The Biur Hagra Shulchan Aruch OC 671-7 by Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman of Vilna, the Gra, considered the greatest Talmud scholar of the recent generation, weighs in. Where does one place the lit menorah? The Mishnah of Baba Batra considered a case where a lit menorah on Hanukkah in a doorway by accident was toppled by a passing camel, laden with flammable flax which caused fire damages, and the question of who is liable for the fire damages. The lights of the menorah must not, according to halacha, be used for profane purposes, but for their beauty alone. We find in the response of the Achronim questions of what to do with regards to what if one is lighting a Hanukkah menorah in the middle of one's brachot and someone who has not lit yet enters the space. Must one start over, or should they continue with the brachot in order not to say a bracha batala. The question of how many candles to light is quite complex. The relationship between Ashkenazim and Sephardim relates to the matter of the number of candles lit on Hanukkah. Talmud Masachet Shabbat 21b states that the basic requirement is to kindle only one light each night of the holiday for all the members of the household. But the sugya continues. Those more scrupulous in their observance, Mahadrin, light a separate candle for each member of the household each night. Finally, those who are unusually scrupulous, Mahadrin min ha-Mahadrin, add one additional candle each night. We follow the opinion of Beit Hillel. As to the demonstrated in the next two paragraphs, this led to a difference in custom of lighting between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. The question arises, does only the head of the household light, or do each individual members of the family light a separate menorah, Hanukkah? The standard of the Mahadrin min ha-Mahadrin has been deemed the normative requirement, but its exact meaning is the subject of debate between Tosafot and Maimonides. According to Tosafot, Shabbat 21b, the ha-Mahadrin, the only variable considered is the number of the night. Hence, one candle is lit the first night, two the second, until the eighth night, when at most 8 candles are lit, regardless of how many people are present. The light of the Torah is thus seen to spread and increase in the course of Jewish history to eschatological redemption. For Maimonides in Hilchot Hanukkah 4.1.2, however, the Mahadrin min ha-Mahadrin level considers the number of people present, in addition to the number of the night. Thus, the amount of candles lit any given night represents the multiple of the number of night times the number of people present. Maimonides writes, if 10 people are present the last night of Hanukkah, 80 candles are lit. In recent history of the Achronim, Sephardic and Ashkenaz minhag adopted the ruling of the other as normative halacha. In the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Karo of the Shulchan Aruch, or Chaim 671-2, like Tosafot, that no matter how many people are present, the most candles that could be lit on the last night of Hanukkah are 8. While Rabbi Moshe Isserles follows the Rambam and allows for many more than 8 candles to be lit in a house on the last night of Hanukkah, thus each person present, he rules, lights 8. Sephardic Rabbi Karo follows the Ashkenaz Tosafot, while the Ashkenazi Rabbi Isserles follows the Sephardic Maimonides, which seems like a reversal of the expected. In his commentary on the Torah, or Chaim 671, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, the Beit Chadash, notes that our Ashkenaz custom is like the opinion of the Rambam, and the Sephardi custom is like the opinion of the Tosafot. This is not what one would have expected by intuition, given the Tosafot represent the Ashkenazic stance and the Rambam the Sephardic. The son-in-law of the Bach, Rabbi David B Levy, actually went so far as to add, B'zeh lo matzinu b'sha'ar mekomot. That's in the Taz 671.1. Regarding the immersion of the menorah of the in the Beit HaMikdash in the mikvah of the menorah, the Talmudim and Tosefta record debates between Perushim and Sudukim. Tosefta Hagiga 335 relates that the Pharisees once immersed the menorah of the temple on the pilgrimage festival. The Sadducees ridiculed this purification. Ma'aseh v'hitivlu et ha-menorah b'yom tov v'hayu zidikin umo b'zu v'ra'u perushim shemitalulin ma'or halabana. It once happened that they immersed the menorah on a festival, and the Sadducees said, "Come and see the Pharisees who immersed the light of the moon." Yerushalmi substitutes moon for the phrase orb of the sun. Yalkut Pekudei 40, number 419, and Midrash Tadshe note, Chama keneged chama, ulevana sheba'at nireteha keneged zayin kochavim hamishtamshim et ha'olam. So those esoteric works are mentioning that they relate the 7 branches of the menorah to the 7 planets. A tradition holds that the menorah represents the sun and the moon. Its 7 lights represent the 7 planets which serve the world. Philo in Qui Rerum Divinarum Heres 225 and De Vita Moises 2:102 and Josephus Antiquities 3:146 refers to Zechariah. The 7 branches are the eyes of Hashem ranging over the earth, pure diadem of Yeshua that sits tahor, ergo like the mitznefet sits. The Sadducees claim that the menorah was not susceptible to impurities because, like the heavens, it was mamala sublunar. As we see from the above rabbinic text, the Sadducees claim that the rabbis immersed the orb of the moon, the menorah. In asserting the immunity of the menorah to contamination, the Sadducees were not negating their otherwise strict stance in matters of purity, but basing themselves on a priestly tradition concerning the purifying mystical power of its radiance. Sadducees critique of Pharisees allowing namport ki hoi polloi to come in contact with priestly sacred kalim, brought down by S. Lieberman in Tosefta Kipashuta, Volume 5, page 1336. Sadducees' tendency regarding the menorah indicates regarded it to be unsusceptible to contamination regardless of its source, ergo its supernatural ceremonial status. Given the Hellenized nature of the Sadducees, they had affinities with allegorical interpretations that the menorah depicted as a source of celestial illumination. See the Tosefta. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, thought to be Essenes, weighed in on this Halakhic debate, whether the menorah needs to be immersed after Hagim. The Essenes of the DSS sect were usually more strict, machmir. However, in this case, the menorah, they were less strict, and they held it did not need to be immersed. At Qumran, liquids were held to be more potent transmitters of impurity than solids. The biblical principle that the ground and water attached to it were not subjected to defilement seems to be followed by Qumranites. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the copper and golden altars of the Beit HaMikdash did not require purification after the Hagim. Mizbach Adamah, which was also extended to metallic altars. Analogously, since the menorah was symbolic of the heavens, i.e. beyond the reach of common man, although the argument lo b'shamayim he exists, may be deemed by Sadducees to be immune to any contamination. However, the Pharisees once opted to immerse the menorah as a precaution. For more on these topics, as well as comparison and contrasts and similarities of the differences between Sadducees, Perushim, and Sadducees, see my paper on the Dead Sea Scroll. So the question arises, how to light the menorah at the Kotel after 1967. After the 67 war, when the Jews reclaimed greater control of the old city, the Jewish quarter, while at the same time leaving jurisdiction of Har HaBayit to the Muslim Waqif, the question of lighting a menorah at the Kotel was dealt by numerous poskim. Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef, son of Rav Avaji Yosef, and Yalkut Yosef, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, OC 671-3, considers how the menorah is to be lit at the Kotel to fulfill the mitzvah of Pirsa Nisa. Rav Avaji Yosef weighed in on the discussion in Yalkut Yosef, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, OC 671. Rabbi Goren, as early as 67, even went on Har HaBayit and blew the shofar. The commentary on the Rambam Mishnah Torah 3.4, known as Mishnat Yaakov, also considers the question. Another question, the question of lighting at parties and events. The question of a public party lighting is dealt with in the Sitz Eliezer 1530. Rabbi Eliezer Yehudah Waldenberg of Yerushalayim, in his responsa, deals with all aspects of Jewish law, particularly pertaining to medical issues and new technologies. He especially dealt with these issues as a result of becoming the rabbi of Shari Tzedek Medical Center in Jerusalem. Rabbi Waldenberg was a dayan and head of the Ab Bet Din in Jerusalem, eventually becoming a judge on the Supreme Rabbinic Court in Jerusalem. Rabbi Moshe Sternbach of the UK, South Africa, and Yerushalayim and Teshuvos, the Hanhagos 1:398, considers the complex case of lighting a Hanukkah menorah at parties, as does Rabbi Yosef Dov Ber Soloveitchik, 1903 to 1993, Rosh Hashiva at YU in New York City. In Harare Kedem, Chabad Lubavitch today, on lighting of the Hanukkah menorah. Today, the Hasidic sect of Chabad are well known for public menorah lightings on Hanukkah. It is noted that Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, that while in times past the synagogue was the most public Jewish venue, today many unaffiliated Jews do not visit shul on a regular basis. Therefore, the Rebbe encouraged the erection of menorot in public areas to maximize the reach of radiance of the Hanukkah lights and to publicly proclaim the timeless message of Hanukkah victory, of the light of freedom over darkness. That is the freedom for performance of mitzvot after the Jews escaping from Mitzrayim experienced freedom from slavery and freedom for revelation. However, the Rebbe also noted that the halacha for his shluchim, that if they are constructing a large outdoor menorah, the maximum height of a kosher menorah, as there are dimensions for large Sukkot on the festival of booths, is around 31 feet high, as a reason given in Jewish law that people don't normally look up higher than that, and a taller menorah wouldn't serve the intended purposes of Pirsa Nisa. Today, Chabad even puts menorot on tops of roofs of cars and has parades in such a manner. It is not accidental that the edition of the Babylonian Talmud with the commentary of the Tzemach Tzedek is often referred to as the Menorah edition, picturing on the front cover of its many volumes the 62 tractates, a leather-gilded golden menorah, an edition sponsored by the Guarneri family. And you can see right above me, that's the edition, the Menorah edition, with the commentary of the Tzemach Tzedek in the back. Very wonderful edition. It's at this point that I'm going to turn to the menorah in history, but before we do that, we have to see how it's refracted in the Tanakh and in rabbinic texts. So the menorah is mentioned in many places in the Tanakh, in Shemot 25, Shemot 37, and elsewhere. The most well-known place is the parsha that bears its name, going up to light the menorah, and that's called B'halotcha. So I'm going to put that on the docket right now. It's one of my most favorite parshiot to learn for certain reasons, for the mystical aspect of what the lighting of the menorah represents. וידבר השם אל משה לאמור, דבר אל אהרון ואמרת אליו, בהעלותך את הנרות העלמו בני המנורה, יאירו שבעת הנרות, ויעש כן אהרון העלמו בני המנורה, העלה נרותה, כאשר ציווה השם את משה, וזה מעשה המנורה מקשה זהב, עד פרחה מקשה היא, כמראה אשר השם את משה, כן עשה את המנורה. וידבר השם אל משה לאמור, קח את הלוויים מתוך בני ישראל, ותרת אותם, וכל תעשה להם לדרם, עשה להם מחטאת, והעבירו דר כל בזרם, וקיבצו בגדיהם, וטהרו. ולקחו פר במקר, ומנחתו סולת בלולב השמן, ופר שני במקר תיקח לחטאת, וקרבת את הלוויים לפני אוהל מועד, ואכלת את כל הדת בני ישראל, וקרבת את הלוויים לפני השם, ושמחו בני ישראל את ידיהם על הלוויים, והניף אהרון את הלוויים דנובה לבני השם מאת בני ישראל, והיו לעבוד את עבודת השם, והלוויים יסמכו את ידיהם על ראש הברים, ועשה את האחד חטאת ולאחד עולה להשם לכפר על הלוויים, ומדת את הלוויים לפני אהרון ולפני בניו, ונפת אותם תנופה עד השם. והבדלת את הלוויים בתוך בני ישראל, והיו לי הלוויים. So we put on the docket, Bahalotcha, and the menorah, in the context of the Beit HaMikdash, I urge you to see the link in the YouTube on the Beit HaMikdash in general, and I have a whole section on the menorah there, and the classified korbanot, and other kelim used in the Beit HaMikdash, and many aspects of the Beit HaMikdash in general. There's even a composition I wrote in about 18 pages in German during my salad days in college, largely adapted from Albeck's German edition of Menachot on the Beit HaMikdash. So the menorah, the name given for the 7-branched candelabrum, according to the Tanakh, was the prominent feature of the Mishkan, erected by the people in Israel in the wilderness, also as in the Yerushalayim Beit HaMikdash. I mentioned it appears in Shemot 25 and in Shemot 37. So I refer you there. I'm not going to read those passages now for the sake of time's brevity. Textual criticism often compares duplicate paraphrases of similar paragraphs. So why do we have the menorah mentioned in Shemot 25 and 37? Well, one method is to compare duplicate passages. So you have the Aseret HaDibrot in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 6. You have the episodes of the Siege of Jerusalem in Yeshayahu 36 and 2 Kings 18. Likewise in Tehillim 18, you have David HaMelech's victory song, Et Divrei Ashirah, etc. That appears also in Shmuel. And the last words of David in Divrei Ayimim and in Shmuel and elsewhere, one other place, are found. So why do we have these duplicates? And scholars are interested in duplicating passages. It's a form of form criticism. So even in the Mishnah, Boaz Cohen would look at, why do we have certain repeating Mishnayos? Like that's mentioned multiple times, there are 4 types of people disqualified as witnesses, such as gamblers, samach bakubia, sports addicts, shalach yonim, or those who deal in demai, unties sabbatical produce. So by looking at these duplicate passages of Exodus 35 and 37, there's been a whole body of literature that has arisen in comparing the similarities and the differences and the important contrasts. I want to now go to Exodus 30. It mentions the wicks lit at dusk and trimmed in the morning. It says, Vehikturu alav aron ketoret samim, baboker vehetivu et anerot veyikterena. And then it mentions, and Aaron lighted the lamps at dusk. He shall burn it a perpetual incense before the Lord throughout your generations. Well, the Talmud elaborates why at dusk. The rabbis also note in the Talmud the wicks were made of the undergarments of the Kohanim, which were so pure they could be used for these holy purposes. Hence are called the Ner Tamid, the perpetual lamp. The purity of the candles and oils is the discussion of great length in rabbinic texts. The exoteric written text says, Command the children of Israel that they bring unto thee pure olive oil beaten for the light to cause the lamp to burn continually, etc., etc. So these are all questions related to lighting in general, whether it be the menorah, the Ner Tamid, or the Olah for that matter, Eish ala mizbeach lo tichbeh, the light on that particular altar shall not go out. And that's the light of every Yid who still has this holy spark of Jewishness in them from their ancient homeland in Eretz Yisrael. And that light can't be snuffed out, even through assimilation and acculturation. And that is a miracle of Hanukkah, that these assimilated Jews who reversed the marks of Brit Milah, who ran in the nude in the Hellenistic gymnasium, and who learned Greek culture, they still were brought back to tradition. Let's look at the menorah in history. And I'm going to look first at some church history. After the Korban by the Romans, due to the sack by the Vandals and Visigoths in Rome, the menorah was stolen by Titus, may no longer be physically in the Vatican. The story that the menorah contributed by Benjamin of Tudella's travelogue, or in Christian circles the Mirabilia Orbis Romae, a travel guide written by a canon of St. Peter's Basilica named Benedict around 1040, is hidden in the bowels of the Vatican. Some believe in the Pope's chapel, the Sanctum Sanctorum, and with the Jewish nationalists who hope to rebuild the temple and restore the menorah to its former glory and function as willed upon the stage of history by a Teret Kohanim who have the Kalim of the Beit HaMikdash ready to go for the third temple, dedicated with the funds from wealthy Los Angeles businessmen. After the Chorban, Josephus certainly examined the menorah in Vespasian's Templum Passus, the Temple of Peace, to which the menorah was carried as booty in the spoils of war. Josephus, as a Kohen himself, also had seen the Herodian temple that he describes contained the most wonderful works of art, universally renowned, the menorah, the shulchan, and the altar of incense. What is the trajectory by which the journey of how the temple religious objects, of theurgic objects, ended up in Rome? They were lit by the high priest, who became, over the course of 3,000 years in Jewish history, a unique symbol and indeed an icon, signifying and speaking of Jews, Judaism, and God of Israel, Torah, Jewish locales, and modern Jewish state. So, the Arch of Titus, built around 82 CE, depicts the menorah with the showbread table and the silver trumpets taken as booty and plunder by the Romans from the Jerusalem temple. The ancient Josephus' ambivalent melancholy in recounting the procession of Jewish slaves forced to walk in the area of the arch in 70 CE is moving, even to the modern reader. With the generals of the defeated Jewish revolt, General Simon ben Giora and John of Gishala, schlepping the menorah on their backs, and then marched to the Colosseum to become entertainment of human slaughter. See, the Romans, even as late as the Ramban, he says the pagans like a good fight, and the gladiators would fight to death. And here we have General Simon ben Giora and John of Gishala, who, after schlepping the menorah all the way from Yerushalayim to Rome, were sent to the Colosseum to be slaughtered. Shoah survivors walked through the arch backwards after the Holocaust towards the east in Jerusalem to bring the menorah home to the state of Israel, which adopted this symbol officially as the state's logo. And the Renaissance Jews were forced to greet the Pope at the Arch of Titus, who would throw down a Sefer Torah in dramatic fashion, which requires fasting, as in 1513 when Leo X, when presented with the Sefer Torah in ceremonial march from the arch, threw the scroll to the ground and proclaimed, "Confirmamus sed non consentimus." I confirm this, but not your interpretation of it, you rabbis. And how Christians paraded triumphantly at other times through the arch, as stated as a form of supersessionism. How does one deal with a unique object like the menorah depicted on the arch that almost comes alive in the portrait of Dorian Gray, like a portrait of Dorian Gray, as light and shadow bring the figures alive on its carved images, as a witness to so much history as the sunlight plays upon them? In 2012, a team of art historians noted they discovered yellow paint on the Arch of Titus commissioned by Vespasian, who, according to Suetonius, Vespasian exclaimed in his deathbed, "Ve puta dea spia." Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god. Perhaps the delusion of grandeur is a half-truth, as the menorah depicted on the arch has impacted almost every generation of Jewish history post the Chorban. What recent scholarship has brought out is that the Arch of Titus menorah and its carvings were polychromatic spectrum. They were filled with all different colors. The Arch of Titus was polychrome and vibrant. Through a non-invasive technique called ultraviolet visible spectroscopy, UV/UVS, it has been shown that we can no longer view the arch as white, and this has changed how we understand the intrepid use of color in ancient Rome. Menachot 28b forbids production of menorot of 7 branches. an insertion of the unique holiness of the Yerushalayim temple and its appurtenances. And Rabbi Boaz Cohn similarly wrote about music in the Rishonim time, that at weddings they wouldn't allow stringed instruments, only drum instruments, percussion, because, heaven forbid, we're supposed to, Al Narot Babel Sham Yeshavnu Gam Bechino V'Zakaron Etzion, that if we were to play at weddings stringed instruments, it might be like forgetting the real stringed instruments that was so sublime, played by the Leviim in the Beit HaMikdash. So too, the analogy that if we had a 7-branch menorah, that would help forget the wonderful, sublime 7-branched menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. The Byzantine historian Proscopius of Caesarea, around 565, writes that the temple vessels were taken by the Visigoths during the sack of Rome during the 5th century. That probably would happen. 2 traditions developed. The first is that the vessels were placed on a boat and taken to Gallia Narbonensis, today called Carcassonne, by Alaric in 410 CE. The second tradition alternately notes that Rome was pillaged by the Vandal Gaiseric in 455, who shipped the items to Carthage in North Africa. They were then taken by the Byzantine general Belisarius as booty back to the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople and on to Jerusalem. Proscopius proposes the legend that upon the completion of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Justinian had the vessels shunted to Eretz Israel to be stored in a church. This speculation influenced the Zionist novelist Stefan Zweig in Der Begrabene Leuchter, the buried candelabrum, written in 1936. Zweig built upon the Procopius legend, claiming that the Jews in Constantinople had tricked Justinian, leaving him with a fake menorah while spiriting away the original to Eretz Israel. According to Zweig's fiction, the biblical menorah was buried by the Jews near the road between Jaffa and Yerushalayim. Shachin Bukharai published Ferdinand Gregorius in 1891, who speculates that the vessels of Solomon's temple included the Lenukas menorah, were shipped to Carthage and then to Constantinople and then Eretz Israel. Gregorius' volume closes with a poem glorifying the Jews as the eternal people, exemplified via trope of the menorah. Enter Hans Lowy, a renowned Berlin trained classicist, who cited Procopius as historical truth, arguing some vessels found their way to Constantinople and some to Jerusalem. Lowy maintains that the menorah remained in Constantinople until the First Crusade, the time of Rashi, based on the work of the Hungarian scholar Shmuel Krauss's teacher David Kaufman's work, which uncovered a gloss on the Byzantine Book of Ceremonies that mentions that the heptacandelos, the lighting fixture of the 7 candles, stood in the palace of Constantinople. The term used by the Jews in antiquity for menorah, heptaluxion, is noteworthy. The 11th century Florence MS of Cosmas Indi Coplustes, a 6th century Christian topography, contains the image of the tabernacle menorah and glosses it Luxnia heptamusos, which a later scribe corrected to heptomuxos, which makes the term heptacandelos suspect. Lowy, however, suggested that the menorah found its way to Constantinople, while other unidentified temple artifacts, kelim, were sent to Justinian's neo-church in Jerusalem. Sukenik and Heinrich Strauss, a generation later, argued that Lowy's position had little credibility. According to Renan Bustan of UCLA, Lowy's theory represents how folklore represents transfers of power and authority, form in this case Rome to Constantinople and then to Christian imperial piety in Jerusalem. Literary legends developed as Robert Graves' Count Belisarius that possessions of the stolen menorah brought with it a curse. This may be confirmed by the Yom Kippur liturgy, which refers to the time of favor, Rebuta, or the days of the illuminated menorah, Menorat ha-Maor, days of pure table showbread, ha-Shulchan ha-Tahor, in antiquity. Yanai, a poet, in historical context, expanding upon archaeological evidence of synagogues during Yanai's epoch, which greatly employs the menorah in artistic representation. Yanai wrote two major poems that were paeans to the menorah and homiletical sources, midrashim of the late Byzantine and early Islamic periods that are expansive in their portrayals of the menorah at a time when synagogue art greatly represented this symbol of Jewish symbols. Now we go to the meat, the bread and butter, the chulent of our lecture. The menorah in rabbinic texts. The measurement of the menorah are not stated in the Tanakh, but the Talmud states that its height was 18 handbreadths, which are 3 short cubits. That's in Menachot 28b. A Hanukkah menorah, Hanukkah in the parlance of Eliezer ben Yehuda, does not have 7 branches based not only on the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days, but also on the Menachot, which states, our rabbis taught, no one may make a building in the form of a shrine, an exedra in the place of an entrance hall, a courtyard in the place of a court, a table in the place of the showbread, a table, a menorah in the place of a menorah. But one may make a menorah with 5, 6, or 8 branches, nor may it be made of other metals. The first use of the menorah as an icon appears in the bronze coin, a lepton in Greek and peruta in Hebrew, minted in Jerusalem by the last Hasmonean king, Mattathias Antigonus. The earliest manuscript evidence for the menorah outside the Bible and artifacts is preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. See my Dead Sea Scroll paper in Cleveland of the AJL. Tosefta Hagiga 3.5 relates that the Pharisees once immersed the menorah on a pilgrimage festival. The Sadducees ridiculed this. It once happened that they immersed the menorah on a festival, and the Sadducees said, come and observe the rabbis who immersed the light of the moon. So I learned that passage with Rabbi Joseph Baumgarten, and much more could be said about it, but we're going to skip in the interest of time. Josephus notes that the pure gold menorah weighed 100 minai, which the Hebrew call kinchares, denoting a talent. Philo, in Pythagorean metaphor of the planets tuning in harmony, an instrument of the music truly divine, alludes to the symmetry of the menorah, mimetically imitating the harmony of music, of the spheres, the planets, whereby the central shaft of light represents Sarah herself. Ergo, round branches were an interpretive decision which assumes a connection between the menorah lamps and the heavenly planets that is first expressed during the Second Temple period. Josephus in Antiquities 3:146 describes the pedestal paraded in Titus' triumph as a wedding cake base, a single base, Maius Basios. So the Titus arch reconciles or does not with the Magdala synagogue, which shows the menorah with a triangular base, or perhaps 3 legs sitting on its large decorated pedestal, as the tomb of Jason in Western Jerusalem has either no base or stand or square on squares. Now let's be memory here. In Beit HaMikdash Rishon of Shlomo HaMelech, built in 956, we learn in 1 Kings 7:4 there were 10 menorot, and this is repeated in Divrei Yamim, the second part of Divrei Yamim 4:7. As the loss of the temple vessels in 586 BCE by Nebuchadnezzar, their restoration provided a template for Jewish thinking about loss and restoration. The Mishnah in Hagiga 3:8 suggests 2 or 3 duplicate menorot were kept in the temple, lest one become defiled, and Josephus remarked that 2 menorot were handed over to Titus the day of the destruction, around 68 CE, though only one is illustrated on the Arch of Titus, is a conundrum. Rabbi Levi Yitzhak Herzog objected to the modern state of Israel representing the cake-like base, which on the Arch of Titus includes animals and a dragon, clearly pagan symbols. As a precursor, diadema column bases of Asia Minor represent not just a dragon as well as the deity Triton, with a nude goddess, a Nereid. Rabbi Herzog argued that the ice cream cake base was made on the way to Rome from Jerusalem with the temple booty because the original base of the menorah was broken. Or perhaps the broad cake base of the menorah served ad hoc as a furculum, or a carrying frame. In Roman triumphant victory processions, Pomparum Fercula, or carrying bases built for processions, is attested in Latin inscriptions such as Spolia Fabricato, Ad ide apte furculo gerens, or war booty spoil to be borne in a procession and parade on a constructed base. Unlike Rabbi Herzog, who objected to the pagan imagery of the dragon and animals on the base on the Arch of Titus, was this Avodah Zarah? Tosefta Avodah Zarah 5.2 said, Rabbi Eliezer, son of Zadok, all sorts of animal faces could be found in Jerusalem, but not the face of a person. The Tosefta description of exactly which dragon images are acceptable and which are not as support of the permissibility for the rabbis for such pagan imagery. We might ask then, why did Rabbi Trani in Renaissance Italy feel it necessary to ask the Mechaber a question? So Rabbi Trani, who you find his commentary in the Keter edition of the Bar Ilan wonderful version of Mikrot Gedolot, he asked a shaila to Rabbi Yosef Karo in Sfat in the 1500s. He says, basically, I'm surrounded by all this beautiful art in Italy, and I was wondering, my congregants want a parochet with the picture of a lion, ox, and eagle. And a parochet, or a curtain, is two-dimensional. So Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote an elaborate response to Rabbi Trani that yes, it is permissible for you to have that parochet in your shul that has beautiful art on it, because one, it's not three-dimensional, lo selecha pesel, it's two-dimensional, it's a curtain. And he cites a lot of sources on Shlomo's throne. There were lion, ox, and eagles. In Zohar V'Chanan 262, I think, it describes the wheels of the Merkavah. The second wheel was a lion, the third a shore, and the fourth Nesher, likened to David HaMelech. So it's an interesting question that Rabbi Trani asked to the Mechaber. The seven branches of the menorah, which Targum Sheni LeEsther associates with the seven pious ones, Chanoki, Kahat, Amram, Moshe, Aaron, Eldad, and Medad, Josephus, and the Book of Maccabees notes that zealots toppled the image of the eagle in Herod's temple. In Hebrew liturgical poetry, Piyut of Yanai, who juxtaposed in pining lament the lamps of Zion versus the lamps of Edom. At some time in Jewish history, many temple kalim were in Rome. That at one time the menorah was in Rome is supported by Sifrei Zuta on Bamidbar, where Rabbi Shimon says, when I went to Rome, there I saw the menorah. All the lamps were pointed towards the middle lamp. Sifrei Zuta was not well known to Polish yeshiva circles, as an edition of the book appeared only in 1910. And that was a modern critical edition. Other rabbis of the same generation are said to have seen the purple curtain of the Beit HaMikdash, the parochet, and the golden priestly headpiece, the tzitz. According to Me'ilah 17a to b, the temple curtain, the parochet, is stored in the house of an unidentified emperor in his Geniza in Rome itself, where it was seen by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, thanks to the intervention of a demon. Avot Rabbi Natan reports that the grinding tool of the house of Avtimas, used for making ketoret, and the table and the menorah and that curtain and the tzitz are still stored, munachim, in Rome. The apocalyptic text, Otiot HaMashiach, confirms that the temple vessels were stored in Rome in the house of Julianus Caesar. Hope for the restoration of these holy vessels is given in Otiot HaMashiach, whereby the Messiah of Joseph will kill the emperor of Edom and bring them back to Jerusalem. Some Jews believe that Herzl was the Mashiach ben Yosef. It's a question. Moshe Idel has published the Odiot HaMashiach and extrapolated how this text played in the work of Rabbi Abraham Abalafia, one of his areas of expertise. So now this is one of the most important. What was the shape of the menorah? The medieval manuscripts in the Rhineland, circa 1300, depict the cake base of the Titus arch menorah, never found wide acceptance in medieval iconography. Yet the Bible and rabbinic texts like Midrash Tanhuma affirm the heavenly source of the menorah from, quote, Rabbi Levy, son of Rabbi, says, a pure menorah came down from heaven. Thus we must want to know if the menorah has curved branches imitating the orbits of the 7 planets, or as Rashi and the Rambam posit, it had straight diagonal shoots jutting off from the vertical sternum. This question is important because Shemot indicates this form, Zaruf Eidos, was shown to Moshe on the mountain as a supernatural heavenly revelation. Chabad follow the views of Rambam's illustration in the Bodleian edition of the Mishnah Torah, representing straight branches from the sternum of a menorah. Rambam's son, Rabbi Abraham ben Maimon, confirms this drawing. The 6 branches extend from the central shaft of the menorah to its height in a straight line, as from the central shaft of the menorah to its height in a straight line as depicted by my father of blessed memory, and not rounded as depicted by others. Rashi describes the shape of the menorah branches as al-kasson, a Greek loanword that appears already in the Mishnah and means roughly diagonal. Breita de Melechet HaMishkan, a 3rd century text, has it that 2 branches go elech, from the central stalk. The BT, Babylonian Talmud Menachot 28b, adds more words regarding each pair of branches. One goes out from the central stalk, and they continue and rise up, nimshachin ve'olin, to the height of the menorah. Medieval Bible commentators, Rabbi Joseph ben Isaac Becker Shore of Orléans in France, a student of Rashi's grandson in the 12th centuries, and Levi ben Gerson, Gersonides, in Avignon, responding to Rashi, looked for clear language that al-kasson perhaps meant diagonal. They both described the branches looked like the branches of a tree, i.e. paired and naturally curved, while a strict interpretation of diagonal is more angular. Rashi comments on 3 cups made like almonds, and each with a bulb and flower, shows how Rashi evokes the technology of his own day in Old French. Following up on a Targum Onkelos, who notes that they were engraved as is done to silver and gold objects. Rashi notes in Menachot 28b that the flowers were ornated as columns with Corinthian capital attribution, are embellished, thus the gold of the flowers was given a floral motif. This fulfills the command to make the bulbs and flowers of the menorah of one piece with it. Rashi goes further than Onkelos, however, making the text relevant to medieval French readers by adding that this kind of engraving is called nielier. The Old French of Rashi's time is nielier. In 1942, Mordecai Narkis identified Rashi's nielier with Nilo work, a form of delicate and minute decoration of polished metal surface through the use of incised lines that are filled with a black metallic amalgam. Now, to bring this up to the modern times in the Enlightenment, Moses Mendelssohn in Sefer Netivot HaShalom also described the menorah. The arch menorah for Mendelssohn stood as a bridge between Western culture and Jewish culture, a fulcrum at which to balance an increasingly complex Jewish identity. That's what Stephen Fine argues in his book, The Menorah. The menorah came, quote, to epitomize the bridge between Western dichotomy, between Jew and Greek, between Hebraicism and Hellenism, between Judaism and classicism, and even between Judaism and Christianity. As our sages of blessed memory remember in Babylonian Talmud Me'ila 17b, and there Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Yossi, who lived a few years after the Korban, The priestly front priest sits, and the curtain, parochet, Mi'ila ad lok Shabbat 60 through B, and Yoma 47a and Sukkah 5b. And the end of the last chapter of Avot Rabbi Natan, the Schechter version, chapter 41, says that the grinding tool of the house of Avi Timas and the table of the menorah and the curtain and the sitz are still stored munachim in Rome. However, as I mentioned earlier, the Vandals and the Goths sacked Rome, and likely there's those two scenarios where the Kalim were taken. Rabbi Gerlich, in December 2014, a senior Chabad emissary, mounted a YouTube video showing Chabad Hasidim holding up a Chabad menorah with a photograph of the Rebbe resting on the arch, whereby Gerlich passionately speaks in Yiddish in defiance of the arch menorah, enjoining Kinderlach, to recognize as a complete Sheker Gomor, total falsehood, the form of the arch of Titus menorah for the Rebbe's blessed the Hanukkah candles benchlicht on the menorah that is in conformity with Rashi and Rambam's descriptions. It is at this point I'd like to bring this lecture to a close to the Al Hanisim prayer from which we basically began. It is a prayer of the purity and of the power of Torah, and not by might, that the Jews triumph over their enemies. And we sing, Ve'ala nisim, ve'ala forkan, ve'ala givurot, ve'ala tishuot, ve'ala niflaot, shasita lavotenu bayamim ahem bazman hazeh. And we will recall again, Masarta giborim biyad chalashim, they handed over the mighty people with muscle into the hands of the weaker, the rabim biyad me'atim, and the many into the hands of the few Maccabees, utimaim biyad taharim, and the impure Greek Syrians into the hands of the pure, urishaim biyad tzadikim, and the wicked into the hands of the righteous, the zaydim biyad oskei Toratecha, and those who sit on the corners and scoff into the hands of those who learn Torah. And this is the spiritual message of Hanukkah, to which I will return and from which I open. We recall the three Nevi'im, and they are Micha, Yerimahu, and Zedkiyahu, that the overthrow of the arrogant, they downplay the military conquests, and they exalt humility, purity, compassion, and mercy that are echoed in the voice of Yaakov in the yeshivot of Shem ve'Aver. And that is the clarion call of Hanukkah, and its beauty, and its truth, and its transcendence. Mamala Lateva, as 8 is Mamala Lateva. Thank you. I want to wish everybody a freilichen Hanukkah and Hag Hanukkah Sameach. Happy Hanukkah.